Hi, I'm Trevor Stevenson, and this is Your Story Will Be Different. This is a narrative play podcast where I tell you the story that comes to be from playing a solo tabletop role-playing game. For this session, we're playing I Have No Railgun and I Must Scream by Jacqueline Brick. It's a solo journaling tabletop RPG where you play a civilian on the sidelines as your sibling fights in a planet-changing conflict. It deals with a lot of themes about war, loss, grief, and loneliness. But with that said, let's dive right in.
Personal heat shield generator company under fire for inhumanely hot warehouse conditions.
I knew it was going to be one of those dark days before I opened my eyes. There's a heaviness that clings to the air when the smog rolls in, like the world is holding its breath. Outside my window, the sky is a murky gray, and I can barely make out the shapes of the buildings across the street. It's only afternoon, but it feels like dusk. Anderson's here, as usual. He brought over one of his plants, an odd little thing with tough, spiky leaves that don't look like they ever need water. Anderson's mom works at a plant research lab, one of the only places around that hasn't been shut down yet. So he always manages to find these resilient plants that can survive almost anywhere. Today, he's crouched on the floor, gently brushing the dust off of each leaf as if it's a precious artifact. I can tell he's proud of it. "This one's special," he says, glancing up at me with half a smile. "They're calling it an ash spike. It's supposed to be able to grow in soil that's like 90% toxic." I nod, sketching him as he works, trying to capture the way that he leans in close, completely absorbed in what he's doing. Anderson has this quiet intensity that makes him seem older than he is. He's the kind of person who can lose himself in a single leaf, a single detail for hours. It's one of the things I like about him. Outside, the smog drifts past in slow, curling waves, muffling the sound of the city. The news keeps saying it's the fault of the industrial zone ramping up production for the war effort, but I know there's more to it than that. Everything feels heavier these days, like the air can't escape the weight of what's happening out there. The paper this morning had a headline about one of the big tech companies, something about inhumane conditions in their heat shield warehouse. Didn't really read the article, but the image stuck with me even hours after I heard it. Rows of workers, hunched over machines, drenched in sweat, all to make the shields that are supposed to keep people like Kelvin safe on the front lines. I can't shake the irony of it. People back home are working themselves to exhaustion in these awful conditions, just so the soldiers out there won't have to. It's like a textbook example of one of those questions from school. Kelvin's face flashes in my mind, unbidden. I can still see him as he was the day he left. His jaw set, his eyes sharp, filled with a determination that felt almost unnatural. He didn't look back when he boarded the transport, didn't wave or smile, just marched forward, head high, like he was already carrying the weight of 1,000 battles on his shoulder. I think about him more often than I'd like to admit, wondering where he is now, if he's safe, if he's still that same person I grew up with, if we even looked the same anymore. Anderson doesn't talk much about the war, but I know he thinks about it too. He wouldn't be here, obsessing over his plants if he didn't. I think it's his way of coping, trying to find life in a world that seems insistent on tearing itself apart. I have my sketchbook, and he has his plants. The smog grows thicker as the afternoon drags on, dimming the already muted light until it feels like we're sitting in twilight. I can barely see the detail of Anderson's face now, just the faint outlines of his features in the gloom. It's peaceful, in a way, like we're in our own little world, untouched by the chaos outside. A distant rumble shakes the floor beneath us, making Anderson's plant tremble in its pot. We both freeze, our eyes meeting in the dim light. Neither of us is saying anything, but I can feel the unspoken fear between us. It could be construction, or a transport passing overhead, or it could be something much worse. The silence stretches, thick and oppressive, until finally Anderson lets out a shaky breath. "Probably just a transport," he murmurs, as if trying to convince himself. "Yeah," I agree, though I'm not sure I believe it. My mind is already racing, imagining the worst. An attack, a collapse, something tearing through the city like it did in the last broadcast we saw. I can't stop picturing Kelvin out there, somewhere in the middle of all of this, facing things I can't even begin to comprehend. Eventually, Anderson leaves, taking his ash spike with him. The room feels emptier without him, the silence more profound. I go to the window, pressing my hand against the cold glass, staring out at the darkened city. The smog is so thick now that I could barely make out the street below, just the faint glow of streetlights cutting through the haze. I wonder if Kelvin can see the sky where he is, or if it's as dark and heavy there as it is here. I wonder if he's breathing air just as thick, just as tainted. I wonder if he ever thinks about home, about me, about all the things we left unsaid. In the dim light of my room, I open my sketchbook to a blank page and start drawing. I don't think about what I'm drawing. I just let my hand move, the lines flowing onto paper without conscious thought. When I'm finished, I look down and realize that I've drawn the ash spike, its leaves stretching upward, resilient and defiant, even in the midst of all this darkness. It's a small, fragile thing, like hope.
Kelvin receives highest military honor for holding Midwestern line.
Mom announced this morning, over our weak cups of coffee,
"We're going to start a garden, a proper one. It'll keep us fed."
Dad raised an eyebrow, but I didn't argue. I could tell he's given up on arguing with Mom about these things. She's had that determined look on her face ever since Kelvin left for the front lines, as if her will alone could make things grow in this poisoned land. The back lot hasn't been used for anything productive in years. It's more of a dumping ground for broken tools and half-finished projects. But Mom started cleaning it, brushing aside weeds and dry earth, her hands moving with purpose I haven't seen in a long time. Dad followed her lead, grumbling under his breath, but digging out rocks and garbage all the same. I stood there for a while, just watching them. It was strange seeing them work together like that. For so long, everything's felt fractured. Everyone focused on their own tasks, on getting through each day in one piece. But this, it felt different. It felt like we were finally doing something together, something that might last beyond the next siren or headline. I picked up a shovel and joined them, driving it into the ground and feeling the crunch of hard-packed earth give way. The soil was incredibly dry and cracked. Mom noticed me struggling and came over, pressing her hand into the dirt alongside mine.
"This ground needs to heal, just like we do."
As we worked, I thought of Kelvin, and I'm sure Mom and Dad were too. The newspaper this morning had run a story about him, a full feature with a headline that called him a hero for holding the line somewhere in the Midwest. They even printed a blurry, grainy picture with his call sign underneath, Blizzard. He was standing tall, his helmet tucked under his arm, his expression grim but determined. The article went on about his bravery, about how his actions had turned the tide in some crucial battle. They called him a symbol of hope. But all I could see was the exhaustion in his eyes. Even through the grainy photo, I recognized that look. It's the same look he had the last time I saw him in person, before he boarded that transport and disappeared into the haze of war. A look that said he was carrying a weight that no one else could see. A weight that he couldn't share with anyone, not even me. I wonder if he's proud of that latest medal they gave him, of being called a hero. I wonder if it feels worth it to him, or if it's just another layer of armor he has to wear. It's hard to imagine my twin brother, the same boy that I used to build pillow forts with, the same boy who would sneak me extra dessert from the kitchen, standing in a battlefield in a 4-story mech armature carrying a railgun, wearing that kind of face that adults wear when they've seen too much. Dad snaps me out of my thoughts. He hands me a handful of seeds, each one tiny and fragile looking. Beans. They're tough, fast growing. Should be able to handle this soil if we keep it watered. I hold the seeds in my hand, staring down at them. They look so small, so insignificant. It's strange to think that something so tiny could grow into a plant, something that we could eat, something that would keep us alive. I pressed one into the soil, covered it gently, and hope it will survive. Naturally, Anderson stops by in the afternoon, carrying a potted plant wrapped in cloth. It's a basil plant, small and scrappy, and it has a deep, vibrant green. He offers it to me with a shy smile. For your garden, he says, glancing over at my parents who are still bent over their work, digging and planting with a quiet intensity. Thanks, I say as I take the plant from him. The basil feels warm in my hand. It smells fresh, like a reminder of something I can't quite place, a memory of summer, maybe. Anderson doesn't stay long. He just stands with me for a moment, looking out at the garden, at the small patches of green starting to dot the dusty ground. By evening, we planted rows of beans, squash, and carrots. The garden isn't much to look at yet. It's just patches of disturbed earth, marked by small stakes and pieces of string, but it's a miracle in progress. A tiny patch of life in a landscape that's been stripped bare. Mom steps back, wiping her hands on her jeans, a small smile tugging at her lips. As the sun sets, I sit down on the edge of the plot, running my fingers through the soil. It's rough and dry, full of rocks and debris, but there's warmth to it, the kind of potential that I hadn't noticed before. I close my eyes and try to imagine what it looks like in a few months. Green leaves pushing through the dirt, vines winding up stakes, tiny flowers blooming in defiance of the smog and dust. For now, all I can do is wait. Wait for the seeds to sprout. Wait for news from the front lines. Wait for the day when our family might be whole again.
Bloody loss of experimental mechatite hits military hard.
The sirens went off today. I wasn't ready for it, even though I probably should have been. Lately, it feels like the air itself is made out of static, thick with the weight of something terrible just waiting to happen. I begun to feel guilty that we had all settled into a routine. But still, when sirens start blaring, cutting through the quiet of a normal day, I froze. It was piercing, this high-pitched wail that rattled the windows and shook the floor under my feet. I dropped my pencil. I'd been in the middle of a sketch and stood there, staring out the window, barely able to breathe. I think I half expected to see the world falling apart, the skies cracking open, or the shadows of the threat looming on the horizon. Mom and Dad rushed into the living room. Dad went straight to the radio, fumbling with the dials as he muttered under his breath. Mom put a hand on my shoulder, her fingers tense, her nails digging in just slightly. Neither of them spoke. I could feel the silence between the blaring sirens, each pause like a held breath, like we were all waiting for something to explode. The siren wailed on, and then nothing happened. No explosions, no rush of emergency broadcast, no warning to evacuate or hide, just silence, stretching on and on. We stood there, my heart pounding for an unhealthy amount of time, waiting for something, anything to happen. I could hear Dad's shaky exhale as he turned off the radio. "False alarm," he muttered, almost angrily, as if the siren had betrayed him, or all of us. He rubbed his forehead, and I could tell he was relieved. But there was something else there too, of frustration, as if he was angry at the world for making him worry, for making all of us live in this constant state of tension. Mom let go of my shoulder and went back to the kitchen, her footsteps unusually heavy. Dad followed her, still muttering, his voice too low for me to make out the words. I stayed where I was, looking out the window, the echoes of the siren still ringing in my ears. Outside, everything looked normal. People were starting to poke their heads out of the doors, some of them blinking in confusion, others muttering to themselves as they went back to whatever they'd been doing before. It was like the whole planet had collectively held its breath only to realize there was nothing to fear, at least not right now. But the fear didn't go away from me. Even as the siren fell silent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My heart was racing, my hands trembling slightly as I picked up my pencil from where I dropped it on the floor. I stared down at the sketch I'd been working on, a rough drawing of a garden with plants we just started to grow in the backyard. I tried to go back to drawing, to return to the simple rhythm of pencil and paper that calmed me down, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. The sirens, that wailing, endless sound, had dug up all the thoughts I've been trying to bury, all the fears I didn't want to face. What if this wasn't a false alarm next time? What if the threat got closer, pushed past the front lines, past the soldiers and their mechs, and came here? And what about Kelvin? What if he's caught in something like this, waiting for the sirens to stop while the world falls apart around him? I thought about the headline I'd seen that morning. Something about the loss of an experimental mecha type. They didn't give any details, just that the military had lost an entire unit of experimental mechs, torn apart in some brutal battle on the front. No names, no locations, no mention of who had been piloting those mechs, or if any of them had survived. Kelvin hadn't been mentioned, but that didn't mean anything. For all I knew, he could have been there, in one of those experimental mechs, fighting against the threat, caught in the chaos and violence that we barely had a hint of in the news. I tried to push the image of him out of my mind, but it kept creeping back. The vision of Kelvin trapped in a burning mech, smoke filling the cockpit, his hands desperately gripping the controls as the threat bore down on him. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to focus on the here and now, on the pencil in my hand, the sketchbook in front of me. But the silence felt too thick. I couldn't shake the feeling that the siren wasn't just a mistake, that it was a warning, a reminder that we're all teetering on the edge. Eventually, Mom called me for dinner. The three of us ate in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see something terrible moving in the distance. I fell asleep with that sound lingering in my ears, a restless, uneasy sleep filled with the dreams of smoke and shadows.
Attacks take out Capitol building. Legislature in chaos.
We have new neighbors. The apartment next door had been empty for months, but last night I heard shuffling sounds and low voices through the thin walls, followed by the thud of boxes hitting the floor. This morning, when I looked out the window, I saw a faded blue van parked out front, filled with what looked like all the last belongings a family managed to carry. The family looked as worn out as the van. I first saw them around noon. A man and a woman, both in their 30s maybe, 2 kids. The woman had a haunted look about her, eyes shadowed and darting around as if expecting danger even here. The man looked haggard too, shoulders slumped, face lined with exhaustion. They were unpacking slowly, moving with a kind of careful wariness that comes from never feeling safe. The kids, though, they're the ones that really caught my attention. The boy, the younger of the two, clung to his mother's hand like a lifeline. The older one, a girl about my age, was standing by herself, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed. She didn't look scared exactly, but there was something in her posture, a guardedness, a hardness that didn't belong on a face that young. I watched them unload the van from behind the window for a while, feeling a strange pull. I've seen families like them on the news and articles about how the fighting is getting closer to civilian areas, about how people are fleeing from the edges of the war zones. But this is the first time I've seen them up close, the first time the war has felt so tangible. After lunch, I decided to go down and introduce myself. It felt awkward stepping out into the hallway and knocking on their door, but what do you say to people who have probably seen things you can't even imagine? Hi, welcome to the neighborhood felt so hollow, so inadequate. The girl answered the door. Up close, I could see the exhaustion in her face more clearly, but her eyes were sharp, watching me with an intensity that made me feel exposed. Hi, I'm Emil. I live next door. She nodded, not saying anything. Her gaze didn't soften, and she didn't invite me in. We stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of everything she wasn't saying hanging between us. Are you from closer to the front? I asked, almost immediately regretting it. She didn't look offended. If anything, her expression softened slightly, like she was surprised I'd even ask.
Yeah, a lot closer.
She didn't offer any more details, and I didn't ask. I didn't need to. The look in her eyes told me enough. She'd been near the fighting, close enough to see things, to lose things. That hardness in her gaze wasn't just caution, it was something deeper. I told her about Kelvin. I don't know why, maybe because I wanted her to know that I understood, even if it was in a different way. I told her he was out there on the front lines, fighting to keep people like us safe. She didn't say anything, just nodded, a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if she's heard it all before. I realized that for her, the idea of a heroic soldier was probably complicated. She didn't look away, though. Didn't close the door or brush me off. Eventually, her mom came to the door, placing a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder. She looked at me with the same weariness, the same haunted expression. I gave a small, awkward wave and mumbled a goodbye, retreating to the comfort of my own apartment. But I couldn't shake the encounter. All afternoon, their faces stayed with me. The mother's wary eyes, the boy clinging to her like he was afraid of disappearing, and the girl with that hardened stare that felt so much older than she was. I wondered what they'd seen, what they'd left behind. Later, I overheard Dad talking about the chaos he'd read this morning. I didn't catch the whole conversation, but I heard enough to know that the attack had been brutal. Civilian casualties had been high. I wondered if that's where they'd come from. The strange thing is, a part of me felt jealous of them, of people who had faced the chaos head on instead of sitting here helpless and waiting. I don't know why. It's irrational, I know. But sometimes waiting feels like prison. Like I'm chained to this place, always waiting for news, for sirens, for something to happen. And sometimes I wonder if it would be better to face the fear head on, to know what's really out there instead of living in this constant gnawing dread. Before I went to bed, I glanced out the window. I saw the girl standing outside, staring at the sky as if she were searching for something, or maybe remembering. Her brother was asleep on the steps, curled up with his head resting on his arms. The parents weren't outside. Maybe they were too exhausted to do anything but collapse inside. I watched her for a few moments, wondering what she saw when she looked up. Maybe she was just waiting, like me.
Armageddon syndrome. Studies show mental health crises greater risk than radiation poisoning.
I didn't expect to see Kelvin today. Not like this. It started just as another news segment. Dad turned on the TV for updates after dinner, his face set in that tense, quiet way it always is when he watches the news. I was half paying attention, barely listening while I drew, until I heard a reporter say,
Today, we bring you footage of our soldiers on the front lines.
I sat up straight, my heart pounding. I hadn't heard anything about Kelvin in weeks. No messages, no updates. I had almost convinced myself that no news was good news, and that silence meant he was fine. The screen shifted to a scene that looked like something from a nightmare. Soldiers moved in a battered landscape, half obscured by smoke and dust, shadows of massive machines looming in the background. The air was thick with debris. The sky was a sickly yellow, and everything looked blurred, like the whole world was wrapped in hazy film. I could see the soldiers clearly enough to recognize their postures, their faces, their exhaustion. And then, Kelvin. He was standing beside his mech, his helmet tucked under his arm, his face smeared with grime. I barely recognized him at first. His hair, usually trimmed and neat, was matted with sweat, and there were dark circles under his eyes, shadowing his gaze. He looked thinner, too. His cheekbones sharper, his face hollowed out. He seemed older, somehow, even though it's only been a few months since I saw him in person, and older and worn down. The camera zoomed in, and I felt a pang of pride mixed with dread. This was my brother, standing there on the front lines, one of the people keeping us safe, fighting to hold back the threat. He was a hero. At least that's what the reporters would say. But all I could see was how tired he looked. Footage didn't last long, just a few seconds, but it was enough. The camera lingered on his face for a moment before panning to the soldiers behind him, and I could see them too. The same exhaustion, the same hollow look in their eyes. They all look like ghosts, shadows of the people they must have been before the war. The reporter's voice cut back in, talking about something called Armageddon syndrome. She explained that it was a new term being used by military psychologists, a way to describe the mental toll this war was taking on soldiers. She said that the studies had shown that mental health crises were an even greater risk than radiation poisoning, that the constant stress, the relentless fear, the trauma were eating away at them from the inside out. I couldn't take my eyes off the screen. I kept thinking about the phrase Armageddon syndrome. They made it sound so clinical, like something you could diagnose and treat with pills or therapy. But the look on Kelvin's face told me it was much more than that. This wasn't something you could just fix. This was something that left scars you couldn't see. Dad sat down heavily beside me, his gaze fixed upon the screen even as the footage shifted to something else. He didn't say anything, but I could feel the tension radiating from him. The same worry and helplessness that I felt. We were both thinking the same thing. Kelvin, out there, facing things we couldn't even imagine. Things we weren't sure he'd ever come back from. After a while, Dad muttered something under his breath, something about the military pushing these kids too hard, expecting too much. He sounded angry, but it was the kind of anger that comes from being scared, from knowing you can't protect people you love. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. When the news ended, I went to my room, mind racing. I tried to picture Kelvin the way he used to be, the way he looked before the war. I tried to remember his easy smile, the way he would tease me, the way he would make any situation feel less serious just by being there. But the image wouldn't stick. Every time I tried to hold on to it, the memory of his face on the screen pushed it aside, his exhausted gaze and slumped shoulders. I sat on the bed, staring at the wall, trying to process what I'd seen. I kept thinking about the term Armageddon syndrome, wondering if that's what was happening to him, if the war was slowly eating away at him, turning him into someone I wouldn't recognize. And then out of nowhere, a thought hit me. What if he didn't come back the same? What if this war changed him so completely that he was a stranger when he finally returned? Would that be worse than if he didn't come back at all? I shook my head, tried to push the invasive thought away, but the reality is I can't ignore it. Every time I see a headline about another lost mech, another fallen soldier, that fear grows stronger. And now, after seeing him on the news, after seeing the toll this war is taking on him, it felt more real than ever. I thought about talking to Anderson, about telling him what I'd seen, what I was feeling, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. How could I put something like this into words? How could I explain the mix of pride and fear, the constant ache of missing someone who's still alive, the guilt of being here safe while he's out risking everything? Instead, I picked up my sketchbook and flipped to a new page. I started a drawing without really thinking about it. My hand moved on its own, sketching lines and shadows, the faint outline of a face. And then when I'd finished, I realized I'd drawn Kelvin. Not the way he looked on the screen tonight, but the way I remembered him, the way I wanted to remember him. Strong, confident, unburdened by the weight of the world. I know it's just a drawing, it's just a memory frozen on paper, but somehow it makes me feel a little better. It's a reminder of who he was, of who he is, and maybe of who he'll be again one day. For now, it's enough to hold on to.
Sermon outlining how to effectuate peace on earth.
I heard about Sylvia today. She's gone. They took her to that new orphanage on 5th, the one that opened last month to handle the flood of kids left with no one to care for them. I don't know how to feel. Part of me is numb, like my mind just can't process it. Another part of me feels like I should have seen this coming. Like I should have known sooner or later something would happen to pull us all apart. Sylvia's parents disappeared a few months ago, one of those whispered about cases where no one really knows what happened. I remember her coming to school with that distant look in her eyes, that forced smile that didn't reach her cheeks. She never talked about it, and we didn't press her. I think we all knew in our own way that the war would touch us all eventually. We'd all see the headlines, the stories about families being torn apart, kids left alone, but Sylvia was always tough. I never thought it would be her. I ran into Anderson after school and he told me the news. We stood there in the alley behind the school, both of us stunned, trying to make sense of it. He looked down at his shoes, his shoulders slumped, a hint of anger in his eyes. I should have noticed something was wrong. I should have done something. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, that none of us could have stopped it, but the words felt empty. I knew that he knew that too, but there were some things that feel too big, too heavy to put into words. The orphanage isn't far from here, just a few blocks away. I walked past it once with Dad back when they were still renovating it. It used to be an old factory, kind of place that churned out machine and parts, and I never paid attention to it. Now they've converted it into a home for all the kids left behind, kids like Sylvia. The building is big and gray. Its windows covered with bars. It's a reminder of how quickly things can change. I remember thinking how it looked like a prison rather than a place where kids should live. I imagine rows of beds, all identical, all cold and impersonal. Imagine silence, the kind that makes you feel small and alone. I wonder if Sylvia is there now, sitting on one of those beds, staring out at the world that's left her behind. I wonder if she's angry, if she feels betrayed. I would. I wondered about visiting her or trying to sneak in somehow. Then I realized that even if I did, well, what would I say? What comfort could I possibly offer her? I don't know how to fix this. None of us do. The world feels too broken, and we're just kids, caught in the middle of all of it, trying to survive. Dad came home late tonight. News was on, droning in the background, a soft murmur of voices that we both ignored. They were talking about the Pope, about some speech that he gave about the state of the world. What did that even mean anymore? could anyone talk about peace when there were kids like Sylvia being carted off to orphanages, where families were being torn apart, where the war kept creeping closer every day? I tried to imagine what the Pope said, what words he could possibly use to make sense of this mess. Maybe he talked about hope, about faith, about holding on to the belief that things would get better. Maybe he tried to paint a picture of a world where people were kind, where families were whole, where kids didn't have to worry about losing everything, but none of it felt real. I sat by the window, staring out at the street. The lights from the orphanage were visible in the distance, faint but steady, like a beacon. I thought about Sylvia again, about all the times we'd laughed together, all the stupid jokes we'd shared. I wonder if she was looking out at the same street, thinking about us, missing us. I don't know if I'll ever see her again. I don't know if she'll come back to school or if she'd even want to. Part of me clings to the hope that she's still out there, still holding on, still fighting in her own way, because that's what she is. Strong, stubborn. I remember the way that she used to tease Anderson, calling him Professor Plant every time he got too serious about his botanical experiments. I remember the way that she looked at me like she knew exactly what I was thinking. I don't know if those memories will be enough, or I don't know if they can fill the empty space she's left behind. But they're all I have now. All any of us have. And maybe in a world where everything feels fragile and temporary, that's going to have to be enough.
Icarus Solutions stock soars after winning legal battle over location of Daedalus low Earth orbit weapons platform.
Mom sat us down after dinner and told us the news. Felt the knot in my stomach tighten as soon as she opened her mouth, like I already knew what was coming.
I've been drafted, not as a soldier. I'll be part of the support team for the mech pilots. They need engineers, people who can keep the mechs operational.
Drafted. I looked over at Dad, hoping he'd say something, anything to break the silence, but he just sat there, his jaw clenched, his fist tight against his knees, staring at the table as if he could somehow make the words disappear by sheer willpower. Mom reached out, placing a hand on his. He flinched slightly. I don't know if I've ever seen him look so vulnerable. He's always been the strong one, the one who kept us steady, but tonight he looked like someone had taken the ground from under him. Finally, I managed to find my voice. When do you have to go? Mom's gaze softened as she turned to me, giving me a small, reassuring smile.
In 2 weeks, they're giving us time to settle things, to prepare.
14 days. It felt like nothing. I tried to process it, to wrap my head around the thought of her leaving, of her being out there, closer to the fighting, closer to the same dangers that Kelvin faced every day. I had already lost him to the front lines in a way, and now I was about to lose my mother too. After a while, Dad excused himself and went out for a walk, leaving me and Mom alone in the kitchen. She turned to me, her eyes searching my face, like she was trying to gauge how I was handling the news. I wanted to tell her that I was fine, that I understood, that I wasn't scared, but the words wouldn't come. Why you? I mean, you're an engineer, but they couldn't find someone else?
They're recruiting everyone with the right skill sets. The war, it's taking a toll on everyone, even the people supporting the war front.
She was trying to make it sound like she had a choice, but I knew better. She was going because she had to, because the war doesn't leave anyone untouched. It pulls people in, drags them closer to the front, closer to the place where everything falls apart. The news was on in the background, a steady hum of voices and headlines I'd been half ignoring like normal. But one of the headlines caught my attention. Something about stocks soaring. The words seemed offensive in their optimism. Stocks soaring? Legal battles over weapon platforms? How could anyone care about profits and corporate victories when people were being ripped away from their families? It made me angry in a way that I didn't expect. There were people out there making fortunes, treating the war like some business venture while families were being torn apart. I thought about Kelvin out there risking his life, fighting every day for something he probably didn't understand. And now Mom was being pulled into it too, while these companies sat back and watched their profits grow. Mom must have noticed the look on my face because she reached across the table and took my hand. Her fingers were warm, comforting in a way that made me want to hold on forever. It's going to be okay, Emil. I promise I'll do everything I can to come back to you and your dad. This is just something I have to do. I nodded, but deep down I knew that the world didn't work that way. People didn't always come back. Sometimes they got lost out there, and all that was left was empty spaces at the dinner table. I thought about going to Dad, about asking him if he was scared as I was. But when I went to his room, I saw that his door was shut. I could hear his muffled voice talking quietly to himself. I realized he was praying. I had never seen him pray before. He'd always been more practical than that, more grounded in the here and now. But tonight, even he seemed to be reaching out for something beyond the rational. I went back to my room and lay there in darkness, feeling more alone than I ever had. I thought about Sylvia, about how she must feel at that orphanage, surrounded by strangers, cut off from everything familiar. I thought about Anderson, who tried to stay strong, but looked like he could fall apart in a breath. And then I thought about my brother, who had no idea what was happening to his family. So I eventually drifted off to sleep. I made a promise to myself. I would hold on to the people I still had. I would remember who they were, even if the war tried to take them away from me.
If we had the funding, the war would be over. 4-star General rails against the Mecha Corps.
Today in class, Miss Darrow announced that we'd be working on a patriotic project for the rest of the week. I could tell by her tone that she expected us to be enthusiastic, maybe even excited about it. She said we'd each be creating posters to support the troops, especially the mech pilots on the front lines. I felt my stomach twist the moment she said it. Think about what you'd want to say to the soldiers, to the pilots risking their lives for us. This is your chance to show your appreciation and let them know they're not alone out there. The room buzzed with excitement, most of my classmates nodding eagerly, already discussing ideas. Some of them had family members in the military, distant cousins or uncles they barely knew, but still wanted support. Others were just caught up in the idea of creating something, of having their work seen, even if it was only by our teacher and a few parents. I sat there wondering what I was supposed to feel. My brother was out there risking his life, fighting the threat on the front lines. If anyone had a reason to make a poster to support the troops, it should be me. But instead of feeling pride or inspiration, all I felt was confusion. A tight, uncomfortable feeling that sat in my chest, making it hard to breathe. I thought about Kelvin, about the last time I'd seen his face on the news, hollow and exhausted, the spark in his eyes dimmed by the weight he was carrying. I thought about the things that I'd heard, the rumors and the stories, the whispered doubts about whether this war was even winnable at this point. I thought about the headline I'd read about some general needing more funding. And his words echoed in my head. It made me feel sick. If they had the funding, if they had more money, more weapons, more power, this would all be over. As if throwing more resources at the problem would magically solve it. It felt like a lie, a hollow promise meant to justify the sacrifices people were making. And now, here I was, expected to support that lie with a bright, cheerful poster. When Mrs. Darrow came around to check on us, she paused at my desk and looked down at my blank page with a puzzled expression. Emil, are you okay? You haven't started yet. I forced a smile, nodding. Yeah, I'm just trying to think of what to draw. She patted my shoulder, giving me an encouraging smile. I'm sure whatever you come up with will be great. Just think about what your brother would want to see, what would lift his spirits. What was I supposed to draw? A smiling soldier standing tall in the face of danger, as if that's what it's like to be a mech pilot? A giant mech striding heroically across a battlefield, as if the threat were just some enemy you could defeat with courage and firepower. After class, I walked home alone, my mind still tangled up in conflicting thoughts. I wanted to talk to someone about it, to figure out what I was supposed to feel, but I don't know where to start. Anderson would probably listen, but he was always so calm, so grounded. I wasn't sure he'd understand the anger and confusion boiling up in me. And Mom, well, she was leaving soon to support the military too. How could I tell her that I was struggling to make a poster when she was about to risk her own safety for the war effort? When I got home, I sat down at my desk and I started to draw, letting my pencil move on its own, as always. Sketched a figure, standing in a vast, empty landscape. The figure was small, dwarfed by a world around them. Their posture tense and uncertain. There was a mech in the background looming like a giant, its lines harsh and cold, its shadow stretching over the figure. It wasn't the kind of poster Mrs. Darrow had wanted. It wasn't cheerful or patriotic or uplifting, but it felt honest. It felt real. Maybe it wasn't what people wanted to see. Maybe it wouldn't make anyone feel better, but it felt like the truth, and that was all I had to offer. I don't know if I'll turn it in. Part of me wants to see Mrs. Darrow's reaction, to see if she understands what I'm trying to say. But another part of me worries that she wouldn't, that she'll see it as disrespectful or ungrateful. After all, I'm just a kid at home, safe and protected. Who am I to question the sacrifices others are making? Maybe one day I'll find the courage to share it, to tell people how I really feel. But for now, it's enough to know that I've created something that feels true, even if the truth is complicated and uncomfortable. Maybe that's okay.
National Guard reports massive influx of war widows, orphans. Some facilities report straining under the load.
It was just an ordinary walk home, the same route I'd taken 100 times. But today, something felt different. The sky was darker than usual, the air thick and heavy. It seemed like everyone was moving a little faster, heads down like they were trying to avoid looking at each other. Then I saw him. The preacher. He was standing on the corner, right in front of the closed-down pharmacy, with a makeshift pulpit cobbled together from a crate and some scrap wood. Tattered banner hung behind him, flapping with the words, "Prepare for the end," scrawled in bold, uneven letters. His voice boomed out, echoing off the walls, filled with a fervor that sent chills down my spine.
Repent! The world as you know it is ending. You think the war is just a phase, just a fight that will pass? No. This is the beginning of a new era, an era of reckoning.
People were ignoring him, walking past without a glance, keeping their distance. But I couldn't look away. I found myself standing there, rooted in the same spot, watching him. There was something in his eyes, a strange kind of desperation mixed with conviction, like he truly believed every word he was saying.
Armies will fall. Cities will crumble. The threat is only the beginning. Those machines won't save us.
I wanted to walk away, to shake off the strange, uneasy feeling growing in my chest, but something kept me there, listening to it.
You think your fancy machines, your technology, your so-called security will save you? Look around. The world is falling apart and all you can do is cling to your comfort, your greed. Every day you see it. Cities burn, families lost, children turned into soldiers. And yet, you act as if it will all go away. It won't. This is only the beginning. A new world is coming, one that doesn't care about your wealth or power.
I wonder if he'd seen the headlines today. The one about the tech billionaire Oakley Bouquet saying cryptocurrency would protect people's assets in an emergency. The irony struck me. People like Bouquet were living safely in their high towers, hoarding their wealth, while people on the ground were losing everything. The preacher turned, and for a split second, his eyes met mine. They were intense, dark, and searching, as if he was looking for something, someone who understood.
You there, boy. You look scared. You feel it, don't you? The weight of it all, the end drawing near.
I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, that I wasn't afraid, that I believed in what Kelvin and the others were doing, but the words wouldn't come. The truth was, I was scared. Scared of the future, scared of the war, scared of losing the people I loved, and he could see it. He stepped closer.
It's okay to be afraid. Fear is the only sane response to a world that's crumbling. But don't let it consume you. Embrace it. Embrace it. Let it remind you of what matters, of what you want to hold on to when everything else falls away.
I thought about Kelvin, about Mom, about Dad, about all the things that seemed so fragile, so temporary in a world that felt like it was coming apart at the seams. And then just as quickly as the moment had begun, it ended. He turned away, raising his voice again, addressing the rest of the street.
Remember this day, remember it, for it may be the last one of the old world. A new world is coming. Whether you like it or not, prepare yourselves.
I finally forced myself to walk away. I didn't look back. I didn't want to, but his words lingered, echoing in my mind, weaving into my thoughts in ways I couldn't shake. Was he right? Was the world really ending, or was it just changing, shifting into something unrecognizable? Later, as I sat in my room, I tried to shake off the feeling, to convince myself that everything would be okay, that Kelvin would come home, that Mom would stay safe, that we'd survive this war somehow. But the preacher's words kept coming back to me. His warning about a new world, a world that didn't care about the things we held on to, the things that would protect us. Tonight, as I lay in bed, I thought about what I would want to hold on to if the world were really ending. What would I save if I could only choose one thing? And I realized above everything else, I just wanted my family to be safe, to be together. Everything else, it's just details. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but for now, I'll hold on to that.
Victory as the threat is eliminated.
The war is over. I don't know if I ever truly believed I'd live to write those words, but for so long, it felt like the war was just a constant in our lives, a shadow we couldn't shake, an endless, hungry machine that swallowed everything and anyone in its path. But now it's ended and the world feels quieter. I heard the news on the radio first. I was sitting in the kitchen trying to focus on something to keep my mind off things. Mom was still at the base, her work not quite finished, and Dad was in town helping with some relief efforts. And then I heard it. The announcement crackled over the radio as if it didn't quite belong to this world.
The conflict has officially ended. Our forces have won. The threat has been neutralized.
He said it like it was nothing, like the words weren't reshaping everything we'd known for the past few years. I sat there in stunned silence, listening to the radio, barely able to breathe. I should have felt relieved or happy or even grateful, but all I felt was numb. The reporter kept talking, but I tuned him out. I only wanted to know one thing: if Kelvin was coming home. An hour later, Mom came home, her face pale and drawn. She didn't have to say anything. I could see it in her eyes. The grief and the quiet resignation of someone who's had to say goodbye too many times. She sat down beside me, reaching out to take my hand, and for a moment, we sat there in silence, holding on to each other.
They're calling him a hero. They said he gave everything, that his actions saved hundreds of lives.
I wanted to scream, to tell her I didn't care about any of that. I'd rather have Kelvin here than a medal or a story of bravery. But I held it in. She needed to believe in that story, needed to hold on to something, and maybe, in a way, I did too. The official report arrived the next day, a letter from the military full of empty words and formal phrases that did nothing to fill the emptiness inside me. They praised Kelvin's bravery, his dedication, his sacrifice. But none of it felt real. None of it felt like him. Kelvin was more than a name on a list, more than a heroic story or a military success. He was my brother, and now he was gone. That night, I went out to the garden, the one we'd planted together, me, Mom, and Dad. Back when things were just starting to feel uncertain. The plants were overgrown now, wild and tangled. There was a quiet beauty to it. I knelt by the basil plant Anderson had given us. I sat there for hours, staring up at the sky, talking to Kelvin, hoping he could hear me, wherever he was. I told him I missed him and that I wished I could have been there to say goodbye. I told him about the things I'd never said, the things I'd been too afraid to share. And as the stars blinked into the sky, one by one, I felt a strange kind of peace settle over me. It didn't make the pain go away, but it softened it just a little. The war left scars on all of us, scars that won't fade easily. Some of them are visible, like empty buildings, the broken streets. Others are hidden, buried deep, like the quiet ache that I carry with me every day. The world was changed, and I don't know what the future holds. But I know that I'll carry him with me in every step, every look in the mirror. Because he was more than a fighter, more than a pilot. He was my brother. I found myself drawn to I Have No Railgun and I Must Scream for a couple of reasons. One of which I'll get to a little bit later. But the second one was it's an interesting look at what it's like to be not the hero of the big story and the personal traumas that go through people that aren't active in a conflict of any kind. It was a great opportunity to turn the camera around and see how planet-changing catastrophes and nightmarish scenarios affect the common person and how their train of thought is affected by it during these conflicts. As you start playing the game, you are allowed to choose, or in my case, I randomly chose the names of the character, the names of the sibling that is often the conflict, and the threat. And for this actual narrative playthrough, I actually left the threat pretty vague, which is good for a radio audience such as yourself. But you have lots of different types of options for the threat if that helps your playthrough, the type, the look, the weapons that they use, and their common name. In my actual playthrough, they were multi-dimensional, reflective, incomprehensible monsters that are hellbent on destroying the human race. At that point, that's when you start playing the game and you have your D20 and you roll the D20 and that tells you what is happening in your character's day. So one day was smoggy. Another one is one of your parents is drafted. Another one is your family grows a garden. And playing through in any typical TTRPG that has a prompt like this, I did get multiple entries for the same one. So I kind of boiled that down for your listening pleasure. What was really fascinating to me was how introspective it became, very personal. I feel like this is a great opportunity for people to not only journal, but also kind of express their inner strife that's happening with them at the time. I Have No Railgun and I Must Scream, as unwieldy as the title is a great opportunity for some writing therapy. For our next session, we're going to be doing something a little bit different that I've been excited to try. We're going to be playing a game called Lost Among the Starlit Wreckage, in which you are a mech pilot stranded in space in a destroyed mech trying to save yourself and get rescued. We'll be continuing the story that we started here and following how Kelvin struggles to survive after the end of the final conflict. Thank you again for listening to Your Story Will Be Different. It's great to see everyone from around the planet that's enjoying the show right now. And of course, if you want to reach out, there are multiple ways to do that. You can reach out via social media. I'm on Instagram and Blue Sky if you want to reach out that way. If you want to help support the podcast, the best thing that you can do is leave a review or rating on your preferred platform. That helps go a long way to help spread the word. As always, I'm going to put a link in the show notes to I Have No Railgun and I Must Scream by Jacqueline Brick. Feel free to check it out for yourself, have some great introspection during wartime, but just remember, your story will be different.